Good morning. Even though this is Tuesday, chapel is a free time for you. Some of us, the faculty, we still meet. So sometimes we pray too long. Just sorry to be a few minutes late. All right. So as you have become aware, we do a little alternation in our format between my lecture and the discussion of the reading. So today we will be discussing the reading of chapters 2 and 3 in Out of Bridges. Right? So we'll begin with prayer. Monique, would you pray for the class? Mm-hmm.
Father, thank you for today. Thank you for waking us up this morning. I just pray that we'll just be mindful of you, Lord, and help us to have hearts that is teachable, Lord, and help us to remember what we're learning through your word, but also in this class, but also through this book, Lord. I just pray that you would just help us to glorify you today. In Jesus' name.
Amen. So in the portions you read for today, Jerry Bridges is addressing the larger question, definition, character of sin. And I think in the syllabus I titled as Sin and Its Remedy. We come to the remedy only in the next chapter, but it talks about, first of all, in chapter 2, the disappearance of sin. From where? From where has sin disappeared? From our vocabulary, so to speak, right? They disappeared from the church's vocabulary, and in its preaching from the pulpit. That's what he feels. And the following chapter then talks about the malignant character of sin. It's cancerous kind of workings. So just to go through the discussion here in chapter 2, the contemporary hesitation about calling sin, sin. Do you think this is real? You're all churchgoers? Yes? You don't hear sin mentioned, addressed, spoken about, the word used much in churches. Yeah? Experiences here differ, I guess. Definitely would, depending on the type of congregation you're part of. But at least some of you, could I see a show of hands? Do you think this is true? You don't hear much mentioned, the word sin mentioned much in church. Yeah, so it's not true about the experience of most of you. It's sort of what I suspected. In some circles, this is not necessarily the case, although in general, broadly the evangelical church and the churches in general particularly, and this would be the case. So I remember a conversation with, it was actually somebody I was working for at that time, was an MD PhD, knowing my biblical background, said something like, all human beings do good things and bad, but maybe not call it sin or something. A statement coming from what exactly is the nature of human beings like. Yes, we may do some bad things, but should we call it sin? Sin is supposed to be a bad word. Right? Not all of you think. So if you think that the word sin does not show up in the church's diction, the use of words, especially from the pulpit in the preaching, how how do you notice the absence of the word sin? Simply that you don't hear it much? Is that? Yeah? What do you hear instead? What do you hear instead?
Well, growing up in Lutheran church, they always have they say the same paragraph of we confess we're in bondage to sin and that sort of thing. But then you have to a message where it's on occasion they'll actually say sin and that's why Jesus came, but it's more of here's everyday application for not to be a bad person. But they don't really use necessarily oh, this is sin, don't do it. It's more oh, well, if you are mean to your neighbor, that's not very nice. So it's supposed to be loving like Christ. So they just hold the one side. They don't actually I don't know, in my experience, talk much about the sinful aspect.
Any other? Yes?
I think even if the word sin isn't used, there's just not often a genuine gravity towards sanctification that this is a really big deal and deserves a lot of our attention. That, maybe that's the trend
Question?
you're talking about. And using the word sin often is probably a sign of being serious about sanctification.
You raise an important question. How important do you think is the word? In order to preach and teach correctly about the human condition and our need for salvation and our need for sanctification, how important is it to use the word sin? Can we talk about what are other possible words to use other than transgression or some other biblical word? How could you get the idea across without simply using the word sin?
I think sometimes people say that we
Stumbled. We fall short, we mess up, we make mistakes. I mean, these are all common use. So what is particularly useful about harping on sin? Yes, I kind of named the question in negative just by using the word harping, but
I think the word sin doesn't the word mess up, the word fall short's a little different, but a lot of times when we use substitutes for it, they mean other things too. We use them in several contexts. But sin has a very definite and distinct definition that we don't use and mix with our everyday speech, so it has a stronger meaning than some of the other substitutes.
so you set yourself up for a follow-up question. So what exactly is the connotation of the word sin that is missed in the others?
It would definitely mean more of a Christian notion, or more of a distinct religious notion of wrongdoing.
Wrong. Okay. And
I feel like the word sin is used in relation to God. It's if I messed up, it could have just been it's only about me, or maybe it's about me and the person that I messed up against.
That's
But
right.
sin, it has something to do with my relationship with God.
Yes, I could have messed up purely and only self-related outcomes, right? I messed up. I did not achieve the success I could have achieved. So a failure is not necessarily God-related. So sin has got, in the traditional use of the term, in theology, very much God in its focus. But let me ask you, when people today don't grow up with biblical terminology or vocabulary, so how do we get past the lack of shared vocabulary and communicate the same idea, not necessarily using the word sin? I've nothing against the word sin. I use the word sin all the time. But is it possible that it shouldn't worry too much about the frequency of hearing the word, that you could still communicate whatever is important in the use of the word without using the term sin?
Yeah, it seems like that's totally possible. What we should do, use whatever word is contemporarily appropriate to communicate that idea.
Yes.
But at the end of that, there does need to be they've got to know that word because it's the word the Bible uses. So they've got to be able to attach the concept we explain in any word as the definition of the word sin for when they open the Bible.
All right, so what would be the essential concept that would be linked to sin? It already has come out that you would need to communicate when you're talking to somebody. Yes.
I think one of the big things that you might miss in the definition if you use things like messed up is kind of like the ownership of sin. And I think a lot of churches like sin is just like, oh, like that's too bad. You like an accidental, like you didn't mean to do something like that. But I think you have to be careful to choose something that will communicate that sin is often willful and like it's something that you choose and it's a rebellion and like it's more serious than just a little accidental thing you do.
And the one essential element is missing from all the good things you said, which is sin relates to God. To God. So to sin in relation to God then also brings up God's standard, right? God's perfect standard. So if there's no perfect standard of God, then there's really not much of a concept of sin. All right, so what is then missing in the contemporary hesitation is to present God as the absolute standard, and this is in a way that society has really has turned away from in its general awareness that God as someone that we are accountable to. So this is in a way what evolution has done to general human consciousness. Prior to that, everybody would have acknowledged God in some form. There were always atheists to some degree. Bible acknowledges the existence of atheists, right? So there were atheists, but most people were theists and therefore had some knowledge of God and sense of judgment even. I mean, it's even in paganism that the gods will judge you for this. And so this has been taken away if there's no creator who made us and there's no accountability. So this is very much so. I would say if words are a barrier, sometimes God's work in accomplishing His purposes some bypasses our own human limitations. So you might still be able to accomplish with the traditional dialogue, speaking about sin and God. Sometimes it may be helpful to lay the foundations of the reality of a creator who created us in His image and holds us accountable, because that is essential for an awareness of a notion of sin. Okay, moving forward, J. Bridges cites an author, Marcia Witten, published by Princeton University Press, All is Forgiven. It's pretty old. She analyzed 47 taped sermons on the prodigal son, preached by Baptist and Presbyterian ministers. And what was her project? What was she looking for? She was looking for how many of them really mentioned sin, or how the story of the prodigal out of Luke 15 was communicated. And here's a quote, it's in the book. In this context, talk about sin appears more to be setting boundaries to separate insiders who are beyond the reach of evaluation from outsiders who are targets for it, than to be articulating theological insights into the depravity of human nature. Well, Nicole, did you understand that quote? What is Marcia Witten alleging that the preachers did with the text on the prodigal son when they were preaching about sin?
It says it appears more to be setting boundaries to separate the insiders.
So this you wouldn't know the answer probably, and I wouldn't. How could this be done? How could you talk about the prodigal and talk about sin and, in a way, do it in such a way that it ends up being an identification of the insiders. Who would be the insiders in the church setting and sermon preaching? Generally, who are they? Who are the, yeah, the church members, those who are there, versus the outsiders would be those who don't darken the doors of the church, right? So the talk about sin appears to be more to be setting boundaries to separate insiders who are beyond the reach of evaluation from outsiders who are targets for it. What is he saying? Who are the insiders beyond the reach of evaluation, outsiders, targets of evaluation? This is connected to the rest of what he discusses in what contemporary churches or evangelicals particularly are doing in the conversation of sin. What is one of the points of Bridges? That when sin is talked about from the pulpit, who are being focused on? The outsiders, meaning the society in general, highlighting the big sins of society. Very seldom do sermons focus on the lives of Christians per se. I taught this course, not this course, obviously, it had to be much simpler than what you're getting, at a church. It was not my church. They had asked me to do a Wednesday series I was teaching at. After about a couple of weeks, an old gentleman came up to me and said, "This seems to be about sanctification." I said, "It is about sanctification." He said, "This is so important. Why aren't we hearing this from the pulpit?" That's an important, it's a serious question, isn't it? You will find that as we go through, this is vital for the life of a believer, and it is in fact a tragedy that very little bit of this sort of teaching is addressed in the regular teaching of the pulpit. So most often our focus in the church, even when the gospel is preached, is really making, and this is important, don't get me wrong, I am comforted every time I'm reminded of forgiveness. I need forgiveness. None of us would be any place without forgiveness. But if all I hear in church is how wonderful it is to be forgiven, and we remind ourselves of this great forgiveness, and this is all that happens Sunday after Sunday, we are missing out big time on God's calling upon our life and His purpose for us and His power, which is given to us, available to us through the Spirit and through the Word to produce, to make real changes in life. So something more needs to happen than this. So sin should not be simply a matter of saying, Lord, so I have been in meetings where people did exactly the Pharisaic prayer, saying, Lord, I thank you that I am at this meeting where we remember you and so many people are not here. So we could go further and says, aren't we so glad that we are all here in church and outside are people, sinners who don't care about God and who are doing all these awful, shameful things. What that does is to make us unaware or not bring us into awareness of areas where our own lives are still continuing to fall short of God's standards. So these are, I think, even there are more than respectable sins which are often tolerated in the lives of churches. Sometimes preachers are afraid to preach the truth because you may not like it and you're going to vote with your feet. And if you're not there, who are they preaching to? You may not change and no good may be happening to anybody's life, but church is going on. So that's a comfort for some. It's not a true comfort of any kind. So we can talk about sin in a way to decry, to condemn the extreme sinfulness of those who deny God. And actually, you have to acknowledge that maybe those lives are somewhat more consistent with their own outlook of life than other lives, right? They don't think there is any truth. They don't think there is any God. What shouldn't they do? In a way. So our preaching about sin and sanctification ought not to be a means of feeling good about ourselves now that we have found God. And I think that is what is being pointed out here, separating insiders who are beyond the reach of evaluation in the sense that our lives are not examined. We have come to Christ, are forgiven, and living halfway decent moral lives, so you are okay. So, question, do you find this assessment of Marsha Witten, the state of fact in how sermons are preached in your church? I just want to see how, no, not for some of you. So does it create insider versus outside mentality? Probably not. I was visiting a church and there was a long introductory prayer before introducing the preacher, which was myself. And the person praying, thank God for, above all things, a recent political victory that was achieved for the political conservatives of the country in the confirmation of a Supreme Court judge, which may have been all right. But it seemed to me, boy, the issues of life have been so clearly categorized into what is going on in the political scene, right? Yes.
I was thinking, like, not personally in my own church, but like back in Missouri, it's a very Midwestern feel. Everyone is, you know, religious in some way. And like I was a part of like a community choir, and I knew that every person in the community choir like was involved in one of the churches in town. And a few of them, most of them were from like the more Methodist, Lutheran, you know, that sort of. And they had a very like strong sense, especially like we were doing a Christmas, you know, concert. Very strong sense of like Christianity. But then when they were like discussing with themselves, like there was a lot of backbiting. There was a lot of like inside sense of you knew that they were doing things that were not right. But yet they were very like clear about them being against all these other things and being in the church. So I could kind of see that like insider-outsider thing because it was just kind of like pulled from a sense of like churches that were more like you were safe if you were on the inside and kind of free to do whatever and free to criticize the outside of their flaws and sins.
So are you from parts of the country where religion is more commonplace and you could really be a church attender or identify yourself as a Christian, but your life really has no bearing on Christianity? So you could really have prayer before particular activities, but when that is done, your conversation is entirely ungodly? Yes. So this is still possible. I think it's very real today, especially depending on what TV channels you listen to for news, to get worked up by the particular political conflicts of the day. I don't think, in fact, I think the whole country has gone mad, personally. Has lost all discernment about all kinds of things. And yet, and so might feel strong conviction about the law, whatever, good, the well-being of the nation, etc. But I have to be careful, and we all have to be careful not to attach our identity to earthly things, including the state, right? Including the country. It's in a way part of us. We have national identities, carry passports, and driver's licenses. So these are assigned particular identity and identifications to us, state where you're living in, the country where you're living in. At the same time, our commitments ultimately are to the living God of heaven, and His concerns are to be our concerns. And so when the concerns of God are not what really get me worked up or excited, and I'm getting more excited about temporary or conflicts on this in political scene, which are kind of, they change from a day to another, then my priorities may not be right. Right? So it's not that there are no wisdom and judgments, discernments to be made in the political arena, but we should not put that as a higher agenda or even a comparable agenda to the larger Christian agenda. And so that would then redefine how we look at people, how we consider our interaction with people ought to be, what general heart and attitude ought to be to anyone we encounter in society. Right? I am, above all, I ought to be a child of God and a representative of Christ, and one who seeks to bring the power of the gospel to anyone I have the opportunity to. And this should be my outlook of the world. And that should define then the priority and importance I give to things and the passion with which it grabs my heart. It's very easy to be led astray otherwise. So it has happened over the last so many decades that particular political parties and movements have grabbed the heart and sympathies and even the zeal of professing Christianity, and it's still been, from things that are important to us, a downhill journey, irrespective of who has been in power, who has been in Congress, who has been in the White House. The trend has really been downward in terms of society's decline. We should not put, you could say, well, the decline would have been faster if it were not for some changes, and maybe true, but even so, we should not set our hopes on earthly things. All right, moving on. So anything that you want to bring up from chapter 2, the disappearance of sin, that particularly grabbed you, Nate?
He hasn't defined sin.
Correct.
Which bugs me a little bit, because I think a big part of the conversation on sin is that sin has to do with more than our actions, but also our preferences. And like the problem is that we prefer the things God created to the Creator. And like, I don't know.
He does define hamartia as Greek. So on page 11, in Greek culture, sin originally meant to miss the mark. But this is not really same as going through the Bible, looking at words for sin, analyzing how they communicate. Yeah. Okay, so we'll have to remedy that along the way. Okay, yes.
I like that he said, actually, it hit me in the heart, actually. Anyways, it said, momentarily pleasure is stronger than our desire to please God, on page 11 as well. And it was like convicting, because like we all, like I should say, I have hidden sin no one else can see but God. And like once the thoughts come into mind, and then when I act upon those things, you know, it's like I'm sinning against God. Mm-hmm. And when he said that, it's like, wow, that's like, but then I think like I have the Holy Spirit that is powerful to help me, but it's still like I choose to act on those hidden sin, and just in that moment, it's just.
Yes, so and actually that it's again has echoes of Hebrews 11 speaking about Moses. So our momentary pleasure takes priority than a desire to please God. It would be good to think about that, how often, how frequently that is at work in our life. That we want something that we desire, or experience, feeling, and then we set aside truth for that purpose. Anything else that from reading of chapter 2? Yes, Hannah.
One thing it reminded me of, I have a family member who is Greek Orthodox, and something she always tells me is like they have this view of the evangelical community that we only really care about salvation and then ignore sanctification. It's like, oh, since there's no works required, that our lives don't really reflect what the gospel really
says, and that's I kind of just felt like he was getting at that, like, that, just as a whole, we do put a lot of emphasis on the gospel and don't really, sometimes, and don't really take it to the point of actually applying what it means to our lives and how it's supposed to transform us.
Mm-hmm. So what has been your answer to your Orthodox relative?
I mean, most of the time I tell her, I'm like, well, that's making a pretty big generalization, and like, what do you see in my life? Like, how do you think I live it out? And usually she's like, no, you seem pretty different. And so I normally tell her that for people who truly do understand what the gospel means and are reading their Bibles regularly, it is a transformation of their entire life. It's not just a conscious thing that they do in their mind, that it actually is shown through their actions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in a way people have been unfair. Those who make such blanket judgments about evangelicals, I think I know scores and scores of very godly, disciplined, God-fearing, God-serving people who are so because of the gospel. It's the gospel that has changed them. I had a conversation once, this was with a banker lady, and she opened up the conversation. She was an Iranian Muslim and asked me about what's going to happen after death, maybe because she saw my employment thing on the account. And to this day, I don't know what the ultimate motivation was to create friendly conversation, the hope of business, or if she was really interested in spiritual things. But asked this question about, so I gave her the answer and shared the gospel with her, and she was in disbelief, but it was the great difficulty she was articulating was that it's so free to not have to do anything for it. Which is true. You just have to realize that there's nothing you can do for it, right? There's nothing you can do to earn righteousness. And even sanctification is by the power and working of God. Both of these involve a human responsibility. Even the gospel requires a response and often a cost connected with it. So even turning to Christ in faith is not always the easiest or simplest thing to do. Often it comes with a big cost attached to it in terms of identification, being disowned by family, etc. So it's not always a simple and easy thing to do, but the ultimate fact is that there is nothing, no amount of works will make me deserve fellowship with God. There is no attainment possible. So this focus on effort, in a way, I don't think God discourages it, but a desire to please God ought to be a genuine desire. But our life begins with God Himself coming into it by our receiving Him through faith and our being transformed through our yielding to His will. So, thank you for your comments. So there is clearly a calling to righteousness, and it may be a fault of gospel preaching people that we have been content just to bring the people in and not be concerned about how we live thereafter, except for, mentally we acknowledge, or by mouth we acknowledge, and sort of live lawful lives and not be criminals or anything. And we have kind of settled for that as of a defining character of Christianity, and this is not. It's not the biblical definition of it. Moving on, and is that still in chapter 2? Is it? Okay. Jerry points out that on the basis of James 2:10, whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. So here's an argument being made for not singling out the big sins only, and to be mindful of how your own life falls short in regard to the small things. How do you understand this verse in James chapter 2? It's on page 10. He quotes it in the middle paragraph. Why do we not also mourn our own selfishness, our critical spirit, our impatience, and our anger? It's easy to let ourselves off the hook by saying that these sins are not as bad as the flagrant ones of society. Are there worse sins and not so bad sins? No? Megan, you're shaking your head. There are not greater sins and lesser sins?
No, I think we have categories, in the world have put them in categories, but God has all sin as sin. So if you break one, you're breaking all. Like for God, it's all sin. And for us, we're like, oh, this one's worse than this one, so that was not bad. So.
Okay. So how is it that one who keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it? How do you understand this? How is it that you could break one part of God's commandment and are guilty of breaking the whole thing? In what sense? How would you understand? Sorry.
Well, it's not about the law, it's about God.
Ah, tell us more.
It's if you don't break one law and then you'll deal with all of them. No, you break part of it and you break everything because it's in front of God. It's just you have offended Him.
Offended Him.
Offended Him, yeah.
Okay. I think I can agree with what you're saying in my own understanding. Cameron?
God's standard is based on His holiness, and when it comes to holiness, perfection must come along with that. And so when the law, which is based on God's holiness, is turned against, or people are disobedient concerning it, then they are breaking the law, which means that they are not being holy.
So, Deanna, you're going to say something.
I was just thinking, like, if you're looking at like the law as a whole, like each commandment is connected, and so the first one being like, oh Lord your God with all your heart, and then out of that stems like your love for others and your care for others. So even if you like commit adultery or like covet your neighbor's house, like that's still like all under like loving God. And if you're loving God, then you're doing what He's asking you to do. So breaking one part of that like commandment of the 10, like, or however many, like they're all connected, and then all in the same aspect of defending God and not respecting Him, which is like the very first thing He even told the Israelites to do.
Okay, Ron?
The holy standard that God sets in His own righteousness is infinite and like transcendent. So like if you even go a little bit against that, you committed a sin that's like infinitely set you apart from His standard of righteousness.
I think all of you are reading it as James wants you to. Would it be correct to say then, in the light of this, whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it? Is he saying that if you only stole, you also committed adultery? No? That would seem strange to me, right? To read it that way. Some people, I think, misunderstand and interpret it that way. See what James is saying. For he who said, so see this 4 at the beginning? He's explaining what he says in the previous statement in verse 10, right? He who keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. Because of what? For he who said, don't commit adultery, is the one also who said, don't commit murder. In the sense that if you have broken one law, you have disobeyed the lawgiver. You have violated, you have broken the law. You say, I only broke it in one part, but that makes you a transgressor, right? To have violated on any point makes you a transgressor. So if you don't commit adultery, but do murder, you have become a transgressor. So it doesn't, to be a sinner, to be one who has broken the law does not require that you have broken every one. Any one makes you a transgressor of the law in terms of falling short of God's standards. You have violated the standard. So I violate the speed limit. The first moment, the speed of my car that I'm driving goes above the limit. I don't have to drive it for any length of time for the violation to have occurred, theoretically speaking, right? Or I don't have to have both also have driven in the opposite lane and above the speed limit to have broken the law, or in the shoulder for that matter. So to breaking it on any one point makes you a transgressor. So this is the point, that the offense is against the giver of the law. The offense is against God. So when I have offended, I have fallen short of God's standards. So in regard to the small sins of life, we might console ourselves saying, I'm not doing that. Well, praise God, you are not doing that. But anything that is displeasing to God in our life is still displeasing to God. So let me go back to then resume this question. Are all sins equally serious or bad? Would you say all sins are equally bad?
In relation to what?
Yeah, that's a good question. In relation to what? So, no. I would say no, because the consequences are different, right? It's thinking bad about someone is different from hitting them. Striking them is different from killing them. So the consequences should make a difference. And how can I make a case for this? I would say the penalties are different in the law itself. The penalties, there are different offenses to different penalties. So in some sense, differing penalties under the law would say that there is gradation for sins. And the Lord Jesus' parables really speaks about the offending servant, one who has offended little, fewer stripes, and the one who has done more, a greater judgment. So their gradation of judgment is spoken of, and it is clearly there in the law. But are they equally bad? Yes, because even the least sin in our sight falls short of God's standard. So missing out on perfection, the least sin is sufficient for that. So it depends in what relation we are considering this. All sins are equally serious or bad in their consequence of making us fall short of God's standard. All sins are equally important in the sense that when I am engaging in envy, covetousness, I'm not behaving like a child of God. I'm not reflecting the character that God wants me to have. I would say, depending on how you, yes. They are not equal in the sense that the consequences are not the same and the penalties are not the same. They are alike in the sense that any shortcoming makes us fall short of God's standard.
Yeah, because he tells the Pharisees that they will receive the greater condemnation.
Yes, yes. So judgments too are different. So in terms of how bad is any sin, what exactly was the sin of our first parents? It's not a hard question.
Disobedience.
Yeah, but see, look at the contemporary definition of what is bad. What's the contemporary definition among your peers outside of MAS Bible College? How would they define what is bad? What is bad? What hurts other people? This sin hurt nobody. I mean, they just ate the fruit of this tree that God told them not to eat. It didn't hurt anybody.
Yeah, but God, by God creating Adam, that's His covenant with Adam in creation, and that they had a relationship. It wasn't just like hey, we're even just looking at a simple friendship, like if you're gonna break that trust, that's still hurting God.
You had to hurt God for it to be wrong? Now you brought something psychological into it, which is why I'm wondering is that essential? What made it wrong? God told him not to. Simple as that, right? It was disobedience. It was, at this stage of human history, it was really the test that God had given him to manifest obedience, freely eat of all of the trees of the garden, no restriction, all you want, of all the trees but one, do not eat of this, and was disobedience. Disobedience. So disobedience of the standard, the particular standard God had laid for them. So in a way this is important. So for example, God had commanded Israelites many things which are not of enduring consequence. Whether they should let the sideburns grow or not, right? Whether they should have tassels on their robes, and this was not even from the beginning of the law, it was added somewhere in the desert as a reminder. He had the dietary laws which were not there before and were taken off afterwards. But for somebody who was under the law, it would have been improper for them to violate that law because they were under that law. God had given them that. So in the Garden of Eden, we don't have any similar thing as in the Garden of Eden about one particular tree to avoid or something. So sin is then transgression, was a breaking of God's commandment. But the point I'm trying to make is that it seems so innocuous for so great a consequence, don't you think? Such a simple thing, if you are not of the same mind, if you did not want to align your thinking with God and want to be hostile and want to be a critic and come up with your own standards by which you think you're going to judge God, you would say stuff like, that's terrible. How could God throw humanity into this great calamity just for eating a fruit from a tree? It's more than that. It was more than that in the sense that this was precisely the test he had given them, told them to obey him on this point, and they chose not to. So this may also be important for evaluating my own sense, oh, what I'm doing is not so bad. Right? What I'm doing is not so bad. It's not murder. It is not theft. It's not adultery. It is not idolatry. It is not doing something else that is wrong that I consider serious. It is a small thing. Should consider, is that a disobedience to the will of God? And it was something pretty simple, but that was actually disobedience to the will of God as expressed to them that cost humanity or immortality. So all sins, are they equally serious or bad? If from one point of view, you may say no. By different criteria, the consequences are not the same. The judgments, temporarily at least, are not the same. But in terms of the infinite things, of the infinite, the violation of the will of the infinite God, and eternal consequences for falling short of the glory of God, they are of equal impact in relation to God. All right. And this, I think we may have discussed this issue, our sins and theirs. Personally, which one do you find easier to do? Talk about other people's sins or your own? You're all good Christians. You're all much happier talking about your own shortcomings than other people's fault. Huh? Do you find yourself discussing other people's sins? So let me ask you something that might excuse the behavior. Did you have a valid purpose for discussing somebody else's behavior? Were you an RA and you're discussing issues of student conduct with staff in student life?
Unless making myself feel better is a valid reason, then no.
That's not a valid reason.
That's what I'm saying.
And I think until we unlearn this behavior, This comes naturally to us, right? This is sort of the habits we learn with our little group of peers in school, often criticizing what, here there are real in-groups and out-groups in those little peer groups, in school settings, often criticizing those outside. And I don't know to what extent we bring these with us and these become part of our overall behavior.
And
Yes.
it comes from Adam and Eve.
Comes from Adam and Eve. Let's blame them for it. Well, what he said was true, don't you think?
You said it's true?
Yeah, she gave it to him and he ate.
But they all sinned.
They
first said, no. They were bad.
I think you are right, but I don't think we should throw the blame onto them, in spite of the fact that we have inherited the fallen character, which has been transmitted from Adam on down. So we know better, right? We learn from their mistakes. So if it is easier to speak about other people's sins than our own, why is that? Why is it difficult to admit that we have struggles with sin?
I think if we admit it, then we're presented with a choice to purposefully stay in it or to change, and change is hard and difficult.
That's very interesting. That's right. So if you admit to something not being right, and this may not be in public, I mean there are limits to the propriety of public confession. This was, I think, it's a real story about a man confessing in public that he had been lusting after somebody else in the congregation. Those sort of things ought not to be done. So there's inappropriateness to public statements of what is going on in our heart and mind. Correct. On the other hand, our fault is often that we are very hesitant to let on that we have any issue with sin going on in our life, or even to seek help, or even in privately acknowledge it and seek prayer support, other encouragement, whatever help may be available to do so. Corinne, I missed what you said. What was your last comment in regard?
But it's Corinne. But
It's Corinne, yes.
Sorry,
Yeah.
you said Caroline. But
No, I did say
oh,
Corinne.
you did? Sorry,
Yes.
I misheard you then. It was that if you acknowledge it or even get to the point of admitting it,
Yes.
then you're presented with a choice of.
Correct. Thank you. So admitting that I am struggling with sin also simultaneously places a burden of needing to change. As long as I don't acknowledge it, I can kind of carry it along as my little secret without feeling a sense of accountability. Right? If I acknowledge it, it then becomes much more significant that I should make an effort to change it. So in some ways, it may be easier to speak about other people's sins than our own, because the other answer, face it, is that we all want to look better than we actually are. We don't want others to know. And this, again, I'm not saying that there's a biblical mandate or ethic to really fully divulge to the public all of our struggles. What we really need is to acknowledge them before God, seek change, and be honest. Do not pretend to be what you are not. But that does not mean that you are going to tell everybody all the troubles and wrong thinking and attitudes and thoughts that you've been entertaining. If you find those things, change. Really. So sometimes it's easier to talk about our sins than really to work on them, and that would also be not very helpful. So, all right, chapter 3. Chapter 3. Any more comments about chapter 2? Let's move on to chapter 3. He talks about sin as a malignancy. The end of, all right. Sin as a malignancy. Very often we think about sin as the outward behavior, the manifest nature of it. What is sin? Adultery is sin. What is sin? Theft is sin. What is sin? Murder is sin. What is sin? Slander is sin. Even if you go that far, what is sin? Lustful thought is sin. Even if you go that far, that's only one set of truths concerning sin. Yes, sin is behavior that is in violation of God's standard. But there is another aspect to sin. It's really our disposition, our internal constitution, the corruption of the human nature, something that the Apostle Paul describes in his own unique way as the flesh. There's something not right about us constitutionally from birth. So this is spoken of in the Psalms, Psalm 51. The prophet, the servant of God, David says, in sin my mother conceived me. It is not to be misunderstood that the act of conception was somehow sinful. That's not what he is saying. He's saying from my conception on, this proclivity to sin. The sin as a character, as a disposition, as a bent, an inclination in my being has been there. Verse 5, behold, I was 51:5. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, in sin did my mother conceive me. So all of you are sold on this truth, right? Human beings are inherently sinful. You've been taught, and I think correctly, that we sin because we are sinners. Now it's was possible for Adam and Eve, who are not sinners constitutionally, to have sinned, but in our case we have inherited the fallen nature from them and sin. And so the gospel is actually not only it's a remedy on all fronts for our problem of sin. It is on the front of being accepted even though we are sinners. That is forgiveness. The blood of Christ cleanses us from all sin. Irrespective of what I am and what I have done, I am presented before God as without fault by the work of Christ. So, Nolia, so the work of Christ presents us in our guilt and our standing before God perfect. What else do you think God has provided through our salvation for us to handle the issue of sin? So what would you connect? That the blood of Christ cleansing us. What's the theological term? Justification. What else is provided us in salvation to address the sin issue? What did you get from God when you got saved? Salvation. What goes in salvation? The Holy Spirit. So not only are we justified, correct? So irrespective of where I was, what I have been, it's a blank slate. It's completely cleansed. It's made completely clean before God by the work of Christ, my justification. But then He doesn't leave me merely justified. So we are our constitution is in a way changed by being caused to be born again. And the enablement of the Spirit is given to us through the gift of the Spirit. So now this would be the pathway to sanctification. And the third step of all of this would be the guaranteed perfection of glory. All of these are part of salvation. So the sin problem is addressed on all fronts by the work of Christ. We are happy with the first and happy with the last, and so with the middle. But this is also part of design, God's design. So sin is a spiritual and moral malignancy, and see how powerful these statements are from the Lord. It speaks about the internal corruption from within. So I chose the Markan passage because he has this additional expression Matthew just begins with this. From within, out of the heart of man come evil thoughts, right? It comes from within. I don't know what the first bad thought I ever had was. Can't remember. But I don't think it came from external prompting. Right? A child doesn't have to be taught to lie. It is the instinct of self-preservation somehow that without coaching or example, they are tempted to deny something that is the case. Some of our behavior, I think, is the outgrowth and training of the effect of the environment. What we are told, what we hear, what we read, what we see, set a pathway to pathways of thought where we would not have traveled if we did not know such pathways existed. Right? The sin has got its own helping things coming from the enemy and sinful persons. Certain forms of corruption we would not know if we had not thought about it or been told about it, discussed in some form. So everything is not, but clearly there are many things that come from within the heart. Out of the heart of man come evil thoughts. So sexual immorality, lust, we all identify spring from within. Thoughts that we do not like to have and would like to control, they spring from within. Even so, theft. Theft is an outward act, but no. Before that comes, especially professional stealing, comes with a lot of planning and thought prior to that. Taking something, even before you take something, the coveting that goes behind it already has taken place in the heart. Murder, adultery. There's murder as capital murder, first degree murder with premeditation. Those things happen that way. With thought, adultery, coveting springs from the heart. This is the great evidence for the Apostle Paul for the inability of the law to sanctify. What the law in fact did for him by telling him not to covet was to cause coveting, not to empower him against coveting. So the rules don't help us become better. Rules only tell us our own inability to conform to God's perfect standard. So all of these come, sensuality, envy. So anybody felt jealous of somebody else? Did you sit down and decide you're going to be jealous? No. What brought it out? Why did you feel hateful towards somebody because they had something you don't? It just happened. It just sprung out of the heart. So this is why our heart is defective. We call it heart, mind, soul complex. The inner person. Sensuality, envy, slander, even slander speech comes out of base motives within. Pride, even foolishness, he says. But foolishness in the Bible, especially in these kinds of contexts, has got a moral character to it. It's lack of wisdom, right kind of discernment about what is right before God, good before God, and not. All these evil things come from within, and they define us. They come from within and make us unclean. So sin is a spiritual and moral malignancy. And see all the ways in which it has metastasized into attitudinal things, attitude of pride, attitude of envy, behavioral things, clearly sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, other thought life. So dispossession, all kinds of behavior. So the sin that is in our constitution, it expresses itself in so many ways. And one of the things, so it's part of the death that we became heir to with Adam's fall is really the presence of sin. It's part of the death. This is what Apostle Paul would say, in one way, death works in us where we mortify the flesh, but the flesh in us, the sin in us, is a form and the reality of death. It's part of the alienation from God that we have. So, if sin is something so deep and central, the solution to sin is not merely behavioral modification at an external level. It must seek something more fundamental, and this is where the new life becomes crucial for sanctification. The new life is crucial because God comes into our life, breaking a form of bondage which we have. So the shocking declaration of the gospel is that if you have come to Christ and have been regenerated and have been given the Spirit, you are no longer a slave to sin. So it should not be true of anymore that we say, oh, I am helpless. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. I cannot do it. This is no longer an option given to me if I claim to be a child of God, because the Apostle Paul would clearly say that you are no longer in bondage to sin. Sin doesn't have mastery over you anymore. So this is an important fundamental fact. So I guess I already answered the question before I asked it. What does the reality of sin as something internal imply as a prerequisite to transformation? What does it imply? If you understand the question. What is?
We need new life.
We need new life. We need to be set free. So we need to be born again. We need to be saved. God needs to come into our life. We are in captives to the principle of sin that is at work. We are born into it, and it plays havoc with us. And we need something more, not something more concrete than just something more. More concrete in the form of God Himself who comes into our life. Sin is spiritual and moral malignancy, the point being made by Jerry Bridges. You're familiar with this passage from Isaiah chapter 6. Read this for a minute, Isaiah 6, 1-7. So maybe I'll read aloud. We can all read aloud. Let's all do something and wake up. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of His robe filled the temple. Above Him stood the seraphim, and one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and dwell in midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Why did I pick this passage for consideration? This is one of the telling, well-known passages that contrast the holiness of God with our own fallenness. But what is the thing that Isaiah identifies as evidence of his own woe, his falling short? Unclean lips. Of all things. He says, I am a man of unclean lips and live in the midst of a people of unclean lips. What does he mean by my lips are unclean? Any thoughts, Tim? What does he mean by saying, I have unclean lips?
I'm not sure.
Not sure. A figure of speech? Metonymy?
Like from his body in himself is impure, and like what comes out of it is proof of that. And so like his words are part of what comes out.
Correct.
It's a part describing the whole.
That's right. So this would be, this is not a synecdoche, that would be part describing the whole. This would be a metonymy. The lips are associated with speech, and his speech is evidence of his corruption. So and the speech of the people is evidence, and all we need is to listen today to see how speech shows the corruption in the human heart, in all that is going on in our society today, and our own speech is reflective. So even something as simple as speech is reflective of the corruption of the human heart. And the remedy is provided by God, that the call from the altar cleanses him. The sacrifice in the temple was meant to atone. The atonement is provided by God. The internal, the core association of sin as behavior manifests really from a spring which is in our constitution. James 1:14, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. When desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. He's talking about the process. The desire in the heart leads to sin, which, allowed to grow, assumes greater and greater consequences. So sanctification needs our fundamental character to be addressed and altered. It begins in the heart and a change of disposition toward God. We'll pick up with that, continue next session.